Great, thank you. Okay, well, I want to tell you about a friend of mine. He is a dedicated Christian man, a faithful husband, a loving father, a regular attender of his local church. Now, what he decided to do, having lived a nice life for quite a long time, was to do something fairly outrageous. He decided to become a Christian missionary. So to leave the security, to leave the quiet and comfort of Australia and go to a whole other country, overseas in fact, to tell people about Jesus. Now he did that for a while, and then when he came back to Australia, what he found was it was very hard to get a job. So he wanted to kind of resume normal life with his family, but he kept going to job interviews, kept applying for jobs, but could never get a job. The problem is then, it seemed like God wasn't at work in his life and in his world. God wasn't looking after him. I mean, he was a man who decided to be a Christian missionary overseas, and here was God not really caring for him, it seemed. Kind of raise the question, is God really committed to his people? Is God really faithful to his people? Does God look after his people? It's an important question, of course, because if you don't think God is faithful to his people, what you'll do is you'll play safe. You'll say, I could never do anything risky like this guy did. Look, the risks are too high. I mean, in these uncertain days in which we live, you've got to play safe. You can't take risks. You've got to know your limitations. It just makes sense to play safe in these uncertain times. Well, as we open the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, we can see that for the people of Israel, these are very uncertain times. They were facing the wind of change. Big things were starting to happen in the land of Egypt where they were living. But let's go back a step. In fact, look with me at the first part of the first verse of the first chapter of the book, the very beginning. It says this: these are the names. Actually, they leave out a word. In the original, in the Hebrew, there's a vav conjunction, which means it's really an and. So the book really starts like, and these are the names. The idea is that it lets you know that this is, well, effectively a sequel. Someone's got their TiVo and they've kind of rewound to remind us what happened in the previous episode. It's like when you often watch TV, at the start of an episode, they'll say, previously on whatever show you're watching. So what the writer of this book is saying is, previously on the Bible, and reminding us of what happened in the last installment of the Bible, what happened in the Bible last week. It's reminding us of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Well, what happened in that first book of the Bible? What happened in Genesis? Well, God made a good world, amazing in its complexity and beautiful in its purity. Humanity rebelled against God's loving rule, choosing to love ourselves, trust ourselves rather than God. God punished this sin by expelling people out of his presence, by letting them live in an imperfect world, and ultimately by death. Yet God took the initiative to recreate his world, to bring goodness back into his world by giving promises to a man named Abraham, a Turkish man, and his family. God's promises kept being threatened throughout the whole book, actually through childlessness and imprisonment and lies and jealousy and all sorts of things that happen if you read the book. And yet God showed himself faithful, so whatever the challenges, whatever the threats were, God always brought his people through them. So that Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob and his 12 sons, who appear in the book of Exodus, written down there, all of these people are now safe in the land of Egypt. See, chapter 1, verse 1 again. These are the names, and these are the names of the sons of Israel, that's Jacob, who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own family. They moved to Egypt, where Joseph had been a slave, but now was the prime minister, and there they were prosperous and saved from a terrible drought and famine in the surrounding countries. And the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, actually closes with the death of Joseph and with the 70 members of this people now safe in Egypt. See, chapter 1 verse 6 picks that up, doesn't it? It says, now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, which is sad, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Now, do you pick up the idea that's happening there? See that? Fruitful, multiplied greatly, exceedingly numerous. Land was filled with them. Like, even if you're an engineer, you can pick up the fact that they're saying there are lots of them. The guys are everywhere. And it's recalling God's blessing on his people. Now, at one level, it's God's blessing on all humanity that God gives in Genesis chapter 1. He blesses the whole world. But more specifically, perhaps, it's the blessing that God gives to his specific people, to Abraham and his descendants. So listen to some promises that God gives to Abraham in the book of Genesis, chapter 12. This is verses 2 and 3. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So the idea is that God is going to bless his people, and here you see the people in Egypt being blessed. It's a happy story. They look prosperous and healthy and numerous and well. But then sadly, as you probably know, the story changes. There come again threats to God's promises. Political change. You see, look at verse 8. Verse 8 says, then a new king who did not know about Joseph came into power in Egypt. This new Pharaoh, he may be part of a new regime, he may just be the son of the previous Pharaoh, we don't really know. But whoever he is, he doesn't know about Joseph. He doesn't know about that Israelite who was so helpful to the country, who helped them prosper, who served them well, who helped them organise their food, who made them actually wealthier through a plague and a famine and a drought. And now, of course, there's growing ethnic tension. There are about to be ignorant and unstable policies. See what he says in verse 9. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. He says, look around, there's all these people, and they're not like us. They're different in race, different in religion, different in language. We should be scared, he says, about these people. We need to do something about these people. Now, to be honest, I don't think this makes any sense. See, what he's saying is, these people who lived here happily and been prosperous, if someone comes and fights us, they'll join them. To me, that doesn't make very much sense. I think Pharaoh is actually quite paranoid. In fact, if this were a movie, I think he should be played maybe by Jack Nicholson, or maybe by Robert De Niro. Hard to know, one of those guys, I think. See, the bloke's not right in the head, as he's not thinking clearly. He's giving into the politics of fear. So he enslaves them, as verse 11 says. They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh looks through this, of course, like a strong king, but he's not, he's a weak king. Because he gives in to that politics of fear. He's so easily threatened that he has to oppress anyone who makes him feel like he's slightly endangered. Now there are threats. Here's the threat, you can see it, to God's people, to God's promises to bless his people. For here are the Israelites defenceless and without hope. But verse 12 says, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and work them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labour and brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labour, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. So they oppress the people, and yet the people are blessed. They still grow in number. And so they oppress them harder. They respond with increased ruthlessness, with great cruelty. And so Pharaoh, that great bully, who's already picked on people his own size, though powerless, now picks on people smaller than himself, like a good bully does. He picks on the children. He picks on those smaller than himself. He says, verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names are Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. He says to those whose job it is to be agents of life, to help to bring forth life, what I want you to do is I want you to kill the boys. I want to see a bit of murder in a maternity ward, a bit of gynecological genocide. That's what I want. Kill them. Kill them. What a gross request to ask those whose job it is to bring life, to take life and bring death. I only wish maybe some of our politicians felt the same way. Pharaoh's plan is destruction. His plan is to bring death. But of course he's fighting against the God of creation, the one who brings life. In fact, we're setting up here the main rivalry of the book, not between Moses and Pharaoh, that's interesting, but between God and Pharaoh, who thinks of himself as God. That's the great contrast, that's the great fight and battle of this book. Well, you see that the battle go on a little bit more in verse 17, where the midwives fear God. They don't do what the king says, they let the boys live. They come up with this really clever lie. They say, see, what happens is the Hebrew women, they have their babies really quickly. I mean, they're just walking along, hardly breaking stride, and out it pops. So what can we do? We can't get there in time. It's just all happens so fast, he says. They say, rather. And of course, Pharaoh, being an ignorant man, he believes them, and they get away with it. And see what verse 20 says, still in chapter 1. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. So Pharaoh's murder plan actually leads to the multiplication of the people. They're like that weed that you just can't kill, it just keeps growing back, like a mythical serpent where you chop off its head and it grows two more. It's that sort of thing. So Pharaoh plans one more Holocaust. See what he says, verse 22. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Well, as you know the story, perhaps this is maybe the most famous story in the book actually, it doesn't work either. So not only does it not work, what happens is Pharaoh's mum puts the baby into a little basket, actually called an ark, the same word as Noah's ark, this little salvation boat, sends him out on the Nile, and not only does the kid live, it's Pharaoh's own daughter who saves him. Not only does she save him, but she in the end sponsors him to be raised as a Hebrew. She pays for him to be raised by an Israelite lady who will teach him the faith, teach him about the God of Israel. See, in just this first chapter and a half, what we're being told is that God is faithful to his people. We see a frustrated king, Pharaoh, who thinks that he's in charge of the Israelites. He can do with them as he wishes. But we also see a faithful God who knows they are his people and who works for their good. God's promise-keeping nature is absolutely at play in the book. That's what you're supposed to pick up from the first couple of chapters, actually, is this big idea. You get the echo of this idea in the New Testament as well, when Paul writes this in Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. God's promise-keeping nature means that God looks after his people, cares for his people, will shelter and bless his people even as they're oppressed, even as they're attacked. That's what you see God doing in these first two chapters. Excuse me. Well, the next part of the story is quite elaborate in any of the movies, but very brief in the book of Exodus. Moses is raised as a prince of Egypt, and there he is out one day seeing one of his fellow Israelites being persecuted, being beaten, and so he actually kills that man. It's in a sense a foretaste of what will happen later, where the people of Egypt are punished for their oppression of the Israelites. He runs off to Midian, which is far, far east of where he is, across the Sinai desert, and where he lives in the wilderness for 40 years. He gets married, has some kids, and learns to be a shepherd, which could come in handy later on. But back in Egypt, a storm is brewing. See, back in Egypt, see what's happening. Chapter 2, verse 23, it says, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Please notice there three important words. Heard, remembered, concerned. So God heard what was happening to his people. He heard their prayers. He remembered his covenant, and he was concerned. He cared about his people. Now, when it says that he remembered his covenant, it doesn't mean that God had forgotten his covenant. Like, Oh man, I got so distracted doing other things. Man, the covenant, that's what I promised to bless my people. I better do that. It actually means he operated on the basis of, he acted grounded in his covenant, his promises to his people. Actually, gents, if you've got a girlfriend and you like to romance her well, please remember that remembering someone's birthday doesn't just mean calling it to mind. It actually means doing something about it. So if your girlfriend says to you, now make sure you remember our birthday, you don't just think, yes, I remember. No, you buy flowers, you buy a present, you kind of do something nice and romantic. That's the way to... See, you act on the basis of an important piece of information. So God remembers his covenant, he remembers his promises, he acts now on the basis of his covenant. That's what's happening in Egypt. So let's go back over to Midian, into the desert, and see what Moses is up to. Well, chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, also called Mount Sinai. So here's Moses having a nice life. He's now about 80 years of age. He's got wife, gets on well with his family, has a good home, secure job, has nice kids. Things going along very nice, thank you very much for Moses. Here he is with his sheep at Horeb, Mount Sinai, having a nice quiet day, you know. That sort of thing's happening. When just then, the whole thing goes a bit pear-shaped. The whole thing gets disrupted for him. See, verse 2, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he'd gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses said, here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, God appears to Moses. God appears and lets himself be known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of his promises, the God of the covenant. He presents himself as fire. Presents himself in a flaming bush. By the way, notice this is not a burning bush. Everyone always calls it the burning bush, but the point is it doesn't burn. So it's a flaming bush, not a burning bush. And if you're an Australian like me, this is great because you can say the flaming bush. Okay, sounds really good. Okay, so at the flaming bush, God speaks through fire, as God will speak later on through fire. What God's doing actually by having a flaming bush that doesn't burn up is he's suspending nature, as indeed he will do later through the plagues and the Red Sea. Moses' job is now to take off his shoes because God is there, and so this place is special, this place is holy. In one sense, it's a little bit like if you go to someone's house who's Chinese and you want to honour them, so you take off your shoes, that kind of idea. Somewhere special, you take off your shoes. Now listen to God's message to Moses, chapter 3, verse 7. I have indeed seen the misery of my people, Egypt. I've heard them crying because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. See again, three important words. God sees, God hears, God is concerned, God cares. God knows the suffering of his people. We saw that actually at the end of chapter 2. So, verse 8, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. You think, oh, this is brilliant. What a great plan. Yep, God, you do that for your people. In fact, keep going through verse 8. And to bring them out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, not rabbits, but a prosperous land. The home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as well as the Vegemites and the Mozibites. God is going to take them into this great land. So if you're Moses, you're thinking, yes, even better. Amen. God, do that. Verse 9, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Hallelujah. And I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Praise God. But now there's a catch. Verse 10, so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, if you're Moses, you think, what? I thought you were going to save your people. I thought you were going to bring your people out of Egypt. What's it got to do with me? And even us as the readers, as we read this, we kind of think, could there be anyone less appropriate than Moses? already we've seen he's a murderer. He's a coward. Here he is living outside of the people of God in the wilderness. Though Moses should be keen on the project, shouldn't he, really? I mean, Moses already knows God has saved him. So because God has saved him through that little basket, through his mum being paid to look after him, surely he'll be keen to help out, yeah? No. No, chapter 3, verse 11 says, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?'" He says, well, what's it got to do with me? I mean, I have no personal experience. I don't know how to do this. Why pick on me? God, I think you've made a mistake. People often think if you have an amazing experience of God, you'll be ready to serve God. Here is Moses, having God speak to him directly through a flaming bush. And he says, I'm just not sure this is a great idea, God. I'm just an old sheep farmer, no one. And God's reply, verse 12, I will be with you. God's saying, yes, Moses, you're actually right. You are a nobody, no one special. But I'll be with you. See, that's the key. That's the point. I've made my promises. My presence with you is your success. Actually, that's the way it works throughout the book of Genesis. God keeps saying to his people, I will be with you. And it means I will guarantee your success. I will do it. I will take care of you. Now, Moses is not quite happy enough with that, so he says in verse 13, suppose I go to the Israelites, and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I tell them? See, this is a clever one, isn't it? Okay. Well, what's your name? What will I tell them? Because no one yet knows God's name. Very clever. And it's a good point in one level, isn't it? Because if you don't know someone's name, it's hard to know them deeply. It's hard to talk about who they are. If you talk about someone as that guy or that girl, it doesn't actually sound like you really know who they are. And knowing someone's name means knowing someone's character or their ability or their power, what they can do, not just identification. So God explains in verse 14. God says to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Now, at first you might think this is just God being a smart aleck. I am who I am. Or you might think that God he's a bit like one of those art students who kind of ask those questions, I am who I am. It's one of those existential issues. Let's talk about it as we sip our lattes over lunch. But I think more than that, it actually means that God is the living God. That is, the God who speaks, the God who acts, the God who makes promises, the God who does great things. So really, to understand this name properly, you actually need to see what God will do, what God will say, how God will act. This is the God who reveals himself by all of these things. The God who not only makes promises, but keeps them. And in the fullness of time, Moses and Israel will see, and the Egyptians as well, its full meaning. God tells him the very simple plan. What I want you to do is tell the leaders, I'm going to bring you out. Tell Pharaoh, I'm going to bring you out. And plunder the Egyptians, take all their goods. Very simple plan. But Moses answers in chapter 4, verse 1, what if they do not believe me or listen to me or say the Lord did not appear to you? Moses says to God, I don't think you've thought this through. They just won't believe it. It won't work. So now what God does is he gives Moses two great signs, two miracles. One is where you take your walking stick and you dump it on the ground and it becomes a snake. And then you can pick it up by the tail, it becomes a walking stick again. The other one is take a perfectly healthy hand and put it inside your cloak, your robe, and take it out and it's got leprosy. And then you can go back the other way again. At this point, I think it's actually quite helpful to think of Moses as Homer Simpson. Because you can just imagine him throwing down his stick and it becomes a snake, and he runs from it, the chapter tells us. So you can imagine Homer doing that, dumping it down, it becomes a snake, goes, ah! And runs away. You can just imagine Homer Simpson or Moses kind of going, look, now it's leprous, now it's not. Now it's leprous, now it's not. That sort of idea. Anyway, God gives him these two great signs, these two miracles, and says, see, the people will believe you if you have these things. Please notice too that God does not give Moses these miracles, these signs, because he's a man of faith, but because he doubts. These are not because he trusts, but because he doubts. And what will happen actually is when he goes and tells the people, they believe him before he even gives them the signs. at least at the first place. But Moses isn't finished. Oh no, not by half. No, chapter 4, verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech and tongue." He says, "Me talk no good." He says, "I've got these terrible public speaking limitations." Although, if you think about it, he's been talking back to God the whole time and seemingly doing pretty well. So you doubt this one. But God makes it clear, verse 11, the Lord said to him, "Who gave man or humanity their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" He's saying, I'm the God of creation. I'm the God who made the world. I'm the God who made your mouth. Now go, verse 12, "I will help you speak and teach you what to say." I'm actually sovereign. I'm in charge over this whole situation. I will help you. God is patient with Moses, actually foreshadowing God's patience with his people Israel. Actually, in many ways, see, Moses is like a microcosm, like a little model of the people of Israel. God has saved him through the context of water. God will do that with his people as well. God's called him to be his servant, to be faithful to him, and he'll ask his people to be that as well. He spent 40 years in the wilderness. Actually, in the end, they'll do that as well. Many other things as well. And here he is, like the people will be, reluctant to serve, reluctant to trust the God who saved him. In fact, now he just cuts to the chase, goes straight to the heart of it. He says, chapter 4, verse 13, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it. I just don't want to do it." In his cowardice, he just says, "Look, I just flatly refuse." Please don't believe the movies that have Moses as the hero. Moses is not the hero. God is the hero. Moses is a terrible coward, at this point at least. One whom God will have to teach to trust in him. But God sends him off. Actually tells him he'll give his brother Aaron to help him. And off he goes to speak to Israel and to speak to Pharaoh with the miracles in tow. Did you notice, by the way, two great patterns, two great perspectives in that great exchange we've just had? Moses keeps saying, but I. And God keeps saying, but I. Because God obviously has a much deeper voice than Moses. But you can see the point, can't you? That Moses said, "Look, I just don't have enough skill, not enough confidence, not enough influence, not enough knowledge, not enough power." And God points to himself at, look at my presence and my power. You know my faithfulness. I'll be with you. I'll do it. It's so helpful, isn't it? That to know that God can even use Moses in his plans. Ignorant, weak, stupid, cowardly, defiant Moses to achieve his plans. And Moses keeps failing to see that God is the one who makes the difference. But God is prepared to keep teaching Moses that great lesson. Actually, it's a very helpful lesson, a very important lesson to learn, especially if you're a Christian person. Because if you're a Christian person, then you'll often see your own limitations, your own inadequacies, your own anxieties. And you think, well, I don't have the emotional or spiritual, intellectual or any other resources for the task that God calls me to. That is to serve Jesus. You might even know that bit of the Bible up at the end of Matthew's Gospel where Jesus tells his people their missionary role and their missionary goal. Let me just read a little bit to you. It's about a verse and a half out of Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. It says this: "Go and make disciples or followers of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you." Now, if you've heard that before, you think, that's just impossible, Jesus. That's just too hard. You're asking your people to reach the whole world, to encourage people to be followers, and to teach them everything you said. That's just too hard. But Jesus says an important thing before he says that, and an important thing after he says that. Before Jesus says that, he says this: "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go do that stuff." And after he says this: and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. See, the mission of God's people to go and tell people about Jesus, yes, that is the meat and the sandwich, but the bread that holds it together is the power and presence of Jesus. So even as God sends his people out to serve him, he teaches them about his own power and presence. Have you ever passed up an opportunity to serve God? I wonder why, if you did. What was holding you back? Not enough skill, not enough confidence, not enough influence or power or knowledge or whatever it might be. The thing is, when God asks people, when God calls people to live a Christian life, to serve him, to know Jesus, to obey him, he does that not on the basis of our own abilities and resources, but on the basis of his abilities and resources, his presence and power. He wants his people to confidently engage in loving the world and sharing the good news about Jesus with the world, knowing that he's in control. It's trying to base the whole thing on the faithfulness of God and encourage us to be more active and more confident, to be engaged in God's world, to be adventurous in serving Jesus. What this chapter, in a sense, is teaching us, echoed in Jesus' words, is whatever shortcomings there might be, God can override them by his power and his presence. So you might have thought about talking to the person in your tutor who's not a Christian, who's actually angry at Christians, who likes to eat Christians for breakfast. And maybe you've thought about talking to them about Jesus and you think, it's just too hard, I can't do that. Actually, you can. Because God is powerful and present. Jesus is there. You might think, I've been thinking about, encouraging one of the kids in the youth group at church, but he's just a bit of a ratbag, or she's just a bit of a handful. No, you can. How about leading a Bible study or encouraging a Christian friend who's kind of got a few issues, giving them the hard word they kind of need? How about starting something new with your friends or thinking about becoming a missionary yourself overseas one day? Please be encouraged that these are not uncertain times. The government may tell you that, the stock market may tell you that, but these are not uncertain times. Just like in the book of Exodus, just like now, as Jesus says, these are not uncertain times. We know that Jesus is powerful over the whole universe and Jesus is with his people. And he calls his people to have a big vision of his plan for the world. To not just live nice middle-class lives, but to have a big vision of serving him, of loving his world and reaching his world. William Carey, who was a great missionary to India and also stopped lots of massively harmful social practices in India, said this great line. He said, "Attempt great things for God and expect great things from God." What he's saying is, do great things not because you can, but because God can. Attempt great things for God, knowing that God will actually achieve them. It's very helpful, very Exodus actually. You see, what he's saying is, I think what the Bible is saying, that is, attempt great things for God. Serve God in great and radical ways. You can do it. Well, actually, in a sense, you can't. But God can. You can do it because God can. You can do it because God can. I know you may have doubts or anxieties inside, but please hear what these chapters are telling us. You can do it because God is faithful. You can do it. Please don't play safe. Please don't take the safe option. Please be adventurous in knowing Jesus and serving Jesus because God is faithful. You can do it because God is faithful. This is hard to believe and hard to live out. So I'm going to ask God for his help. So let's pray. Dear Father, thank you so much for the book of Exodus, for what it teaches us about yourself, your people, and the way that you work for your people. Please help us to believe the truth that's involved in it. Please help us to see the way that you are able to rule the world, able to bless your people even as they're oppressed. Please help us, we pray, those of us who believe in you, to be serious about serving you, to be trusting and adventurous. Know that we can do it because you will do it in your great faithfulness. And Father, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, should I stop for questions and do that sort of thing? Is that a good thing?
Yeah.
You might have questions about anything talked about today or anything connected to that. So let me give you a chance to ask questions if you'd like to. We've got about 4 minutes, I think. Any questions, or can we use it for? No. Okay. Good. Thanks. Yeah, mate.
Yeah, if it's God that does everything, why does God need a human representative? Why would he need to use Moses or want to use Moses?
That's
actually
Great question. That's an excellent question. I don't think God needs to use Moses. Yeah, so I think that distinction even you made in your question is a good one. But God chooses to use Moses. In fact, this is the amazing thing, that God has made the world and yet made humanity intermediate rulers of the world under him. So God could have just made the world a good and beautiful place filled with animals and good things, but he chose humanity to do that, even though we stuffed it up, right? So God seems to be longing to use human agency to rule over his world in a good way. And here he is again, God choosing to use human agency to establish his rule to a new extent in the Exodus, kind of that whole experience. And even as he saves the world, he chooses a human being, actually in his son, to become a human being, to do it again. So God's keen on human agency, even though he doesn't need it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Anything else? Anyone else? We're done. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. It's good to put all those Sunday school stories about Moses and the bulrushes into